Hello, welcome to another CleveTech Tech Tip video, and today we're progressing with our build of our JK chassis and we're going to do another step. So if you haven't seen my previous videos where we've flattened the pans, we've flattened the center section, we've fitted the J-bars and we've soldered in the bushes, you can find links to those videos in the description below. But today we're going to fit our pin tubes. Now, I normally say this is a really complicated thing and there's a lot more to think about, but this is actually pretty simple. So let's get on with it. Right, so I'm going to install these pin tubes here. So we're going to have floating pin tubes. Now these are from JK. So they come as a little set of 4 pin tubes and 4 little collars, and they fit together really nicely. So the little collar slides onto the pin tube without hardly any clearance, which is really nice product. You can buy them from other manufacturers. I think Red Fox actually sell some floating pin tubes like this, or say you could turn up and make your own if you really wanted to. So these are the ones I'm actually going to install today. So why are we installing floating pin tubes and why are we not soldering them directly to the chassis? Well, soldering them directly to the chassis can mean that you have a slightly lighter car because there has to be slightly less pin tube, but trying to isolate any vibrations from the body shell onto the chassis is a good move, because you don't want the vibrating body shell to transfer those vibrations to the chassis, which then starts vibrating, which can affect your handling. So something between the body shell and the pans where your body shell is mounted to isolate that vibration is a good move. So floating pin tubes work very well to do that. So I'm going to insert my floating pin tube through the pinhole. Now I've deburred all of these holes, again using a little knife, and I've scraped around the inside of all the holes to deburr them to make sure that my pin tube floats nicely and wobbles around inside the hole. I've also got my little collar here, which I'm able to slide on. A pair of tweezers can help here to slide that on. And I've got this little tool here. Now this little tool here is a bit of old circuit board that I've just cleaned off the actual copper part of the circuit board, and it is 0.68 millimeters thick, pretty much 0.7 millimeters thick, and I've got a little slot in it. Now that slot matches the width of the diameter of the pin tube. And you'll see how I'm going to use this in a moment. So I'm going to slide my pin tube in through my deburred holes. Take my little collar and slide that onto the pin tube. There we go. You can use a pair of tweezers if that's a little bit hard. Then I'm going to take something heavy. So I'm going to use my little blocks, my jig blocks that I used in my last video. So if you haven't seen that, there's a link on the screen now. So they hold the pin tube in place. Then I can take my little tool and I'm going to put my tool onto the pin tube, and I'm going to push the little collar up to that tool with my knife. Now my tool is basically doing a little spacing between the chassis and the collar to equal the amount of wobble on each of the floating pin tubes. So it's just there as a spacer, and it's also serving the purpose of having a little gap in between, so I'm less likely to solder the collar to the chassis. So put a little bit of flux on, so I hold that in place there, push that up, hold that with my knife, put a little bit of flux around the pin tube, and then we just tack it on like that. It should be fairly quick. And I can remove that remove those, and you should be able to see a nice solder joint like that. Let's just rotate it round and see has it flowed all the way around. You can see, yes, it's flowed all the way around and it's soldered that colour on. So if your iron is hot enough, this is about 400 degrees C on my iron. So I've got that little bit of float there. I've managed to achieve that movement. So let's carry on, let's do the others so you can watch again when I do that task. There we are, tube number 2. Another little useful tip that can sometimes help when you're soldering these on is just before you push the collar all the way up, you can put a tiny drop of oil on the pin tube. That will also help avoid soldering the collar to the chassis or the pin tube to the chassis. So let's carry on. So there we have it. 4 pin tubes soldered in. Let's clean them up and let's have a closer look at them. So we're back after giving it a good scrubbing and cleaning up with Toro. Again, I'll put a picture on the screen. I used Toro last time. It's really good stuff. I say in the UK, I think you can get something called Astonish. But generally, just with these chassis, just a scrub with soap and water or washing up liquid and water. Give it a good scrub and a dry is enough to stop any flux from eating away at the chassis and any steel parts and corroding the brass, etc. So you can see they did quite a nice job on these. Solder's flowed all the way around but hasn't flowed into where it goes through the hole. I would say if you're doing your pin tubes for the first time, floating pin tubes for the first time, make sure you do put that little drop of oil in there and it will stop the solder from flowing all the way through the collar and soldering your pin tube into the mount. So that's a really good tip, is to use that little bit of oil. But a little confession to make. I've actually, when I started my video, I suggested that I was going to be using a tool that had 0.7mm clearance for the floating pin tubes. I actually ended up using a tool with 0.5. I changed my mind halfway through. So these have 0.5mm of float. But you can take a piece of old circuit board like I did and just trim it down, or a bit of aluminium, something like that. Put that little groove into it like this, and then you can use that as your spacer to get your equal amount of float on each pin tube. Obviously you're relying on the fact that the holes in the chassis are all the same size, but they're pretty close. So thank you for watching once again. It was a fairly easy, simple job today, and we're nearly there. We have a assembled chassis now. So we've got things left. We've got the guide to do, we've got the motor and gears to do, and mounting of the body. See you next time. Bye.